On May 11, 1979, in a suite at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel in Los Angeles, a 66-year-old woman died of a heart attack. She had been, at the height of her life, the richest woman in the world. Her name was Barbara Woolworth Hutton. At 21, she had inherited a fortune equivalent in today's values to $900 million. She had been married 7 times, to 2 princes, a count, a baron, an international playboy, a Hollywood actor, and an artist. She had owned palaces in Tangier, Cuernavaca, Paris, London, and several other cities. She had thrown parties that the press described as having come straight out of the pages of 1001 Nights. She had given away money with an impulsiveness so total that not even her financial advisors could calculate exactly how much she had donated over the course of her life. And when she died, in that Beverly Wilshire suite surrounded by half a dozen nurses and doctors, who were doing little more than keeping her in a state of constant sedation, she had less than $3,500 in the bank. Only 10 people attended her funeral. This is the story of Barbara Hutton, not the story the tabloids told for 50 years, the story of scandal and excess, and the woman who kept marrying men who robbed her. It is the story of a little girl who found her mother's body when she was 4 years old, and who spent the rest of her life trying to buy the one thing money cannot buy: the certainty of being loved for who you are, and not for what you have. To understand Barbara Hutton, you first have to understand Frank Winfield Woolworth, her grandfather, the man who built the fortune she destroyed. Woolworth was born in 1852 in upstate New York, into a farming family with nothing remarkable to its name except the ambition of its eldest son. At 22, Woolworth had an idea that would permanently change the way Americans bought their everyday things. A store where everything cost 5 or 10 cents. No need to ask the price. No need to negotiate. The items were on display with a tag that said exactly what they cost. It was the democratization of commerce for the working classes in the age of industrialization. The first Woolworth store, opened in Utica, New York, in 1879, failed. The second, in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, was an immediate success. By 1917, the year he died, he had more than 1,000 stores open across the United States and abroad, and had built in Manhattan the tallest skyscraper in the world at that time, the Woolworth Building, 57 stories high, which people called the Cathedral of Commerce. He was a multi-hundred millionaire in an era when most Americans earned less than $2,000 a year. He had 3 daughters, Helena, Edna, and Jessie. Edna, the middle one, was born in 1883 and married Franklin Laws Hutton, a stockbroker and co-founder of the investment firm E.F. Hutton. It was a marriage Frank Woolworth tried to prevent because he distrusted Franklin, a man the chroniclers of the time described as brilliant in business and disastrous in his personal life, a womanizer, an absentee father, more interested in his romantic conquests than in his family. Woolworth was right. The marriage of Edna and Franklin was, by all available accounts, profoundly unhappy from the start. Barbara Woolworth Hutton was born on November 14, 1912, in New York. She was an only child. Her father was rarely home. Her mother, Edna, who suffered from depression and had spent years enduring Franklin's infidelities, deteriorated slowly until May 2, 1917, when on the 5th floor of the Plaza Hotel, where the family was staying, she died in circumstances officially recorded as suicide. Barbara was 4 years old, and she was the one who found the body. That moment, that image of a 4-year-old girl in the doorway of a hotel room finding her mother dead, is the image that defines the entire story of Barbara Hutton. Because what happened afterward was that no one quite knew what to do with that child. Her father, who was never a father in any real sense of the word, handed her over to her Woolworth grandparents. When the grandparents died, she was passed along to various aunts and uncles, handed from one to the next. The richest little girl in America grew up without a fixed home, without a present father, without a mother, in luxury hotels and borrowed residences where there was always staff and never anyone who truly loved her. During that period, the butler who cared for her said something that Barbara would repeat decades later in the rare interview she gave. "One day, you may be the richest little girl in the world, and all that means is that someone will want to marry you for your money." The butler had 10 years of foresight and a prophetic precision that no one around her at the time could have matched. Barbara studied at the finest boarding schools on the East Coast: Miss Shin's School for Girls, the Santa Barbara School for Girls, and finally, Miss Porter's School in Farmington, Connecticut, the most exclusive institution in the country for young women from aristocratic families. She graduated in 1929. She was an attractive young woman, fine-featured, with an impeccable education in languages, art, and social protocol. She spoke French. She knew music and literature. She had the perfect formation for the role the world expected her to play: grande dame of American high society. The world Barbara inhabited between 1930 and 1979 was one in which the extreme wealth of a young woman produced a specific kind of predation that the 20th century had not invented but had perfected. The European aristocrats ruined by the wars and revolutions of the century were a numerous and desperate social category: men with titles who couldn't eat and castles they couldn't heat, who looked at American heiresses as the natural solution to their problems. The Medivanists, who called themselves Georgian princes, even though the Soviet conquest of Georgia had invalidated that title years earlier, were the best-known example of this type, but they were far from the only one. All of Europe was full of noble families, with brilliant genealogical archives and empty bank accounts. What made Barbara vulnerable was not just the money. It was the combination of money with the hunger for love of an orphan who had never learned to evaluate the intentions of those who approached her. Doris Duke, her contemporary and rival, had the same fortune and did not marry 7 times. Doris was harder, more suspicious, more capable of applying the advice her father gave her on his deathbed. Trust no one. Barbara never received that advice, or if she received some version of it, she couldn't apply it, because she needed too desperately to believe in the person in front of her to also be able to doubt them. The rivalry between Barbara and Doris Duke has the structure of a biblical story of 2 sisters who are not sisters, but share a destiny. Born a week apart in 1912, into wealthy New York families, they debuted in society the same year at the same kind of scandalous parties. The press baptized them the Golden Twins and followed them for decades as if they were a single phenomenon requiring observation in tandem. They lived parallel lives. Barbara bought palaces in Tangier. Doris built a Hawaiian mansion in the Islamic style she called Shangri-La. Barbara collected European husbands with titles. Doris collected lovers with artistic talent. Both were generous with money and lonely in the ways that mattered. The Rubirosa episode, which consumed Barbara's 5th marriage in 53 days in 1953 and 1954, is perhaps the best summary of the dynamic between the two. Doris had married Rubirosa in 1947. The marriage had lasted less than a year. Doris attempted suicide during that marriage. Rubirosa left with alimony, racing cars, a converted aircraft, and $25,000 a year for life. And 6 years later, Barbara married him. The press interpreted this as a competitive maneuver by Barbara to take what Doris had had. The reality, as biographers who studied the period most closely suggest, was probably simpler and sadder. Barbara chose Rubirosa because he was exactly the type of man she always chose: someone who arrived with promises and left with checks. And the Doris coincidence was almost incidental. In 1930, for her social debut party in New York, her father organized a ball at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel. The total cost was $60,000 in the depths of the Great Depression, when millions of Americans were standing in soup kitchen lines. The newspapers ran the numbers and published them with the outrage those figures deserved. The ball included 4 orchestras, 200 waiters, 2,000 bottles of champagne, 1,000 7-course dinners, and 1,000 breakfasts. Maurice Chevalier, dressed as Santa Claus, greeted guests as they arrived. Each attendee received a pocket-sized jewelry case with unset diamonds, emeralds, rubies, and sapphires. The national press called her the most irresponsible girl in America. They sent her to Europe to let the scandal die down. She was 18 years old. She would officially inherit her fortune at 21. And in the meantime, the European fortune hunters already knew perfectly well who she was and what she was worth. On June 22, 1933 in Paris, Barbara married Prince Alexis Midivani. She was 20 years old. It was the first time she had been married. Mdivani belonged to a Georgian family that had fled to Paris when the Soviets invaded Georgia in 1921 and had since then lived off the myth of their lost nobility and the money of the women they convinced it was worth paying for that myth. The Mdivani brothers were known in European high society circles as the wedding princes because none of them had any money of their own, but all of them knew exactly how to get others to give it to them. Alexis arrived at the marriage with Barbara having just been engaged to Louise Van Allen of the Astor family, whom he abandoned when Barbara appeared with her $40 million newly inherited dollars. On the wedding night, Alexis looked at his wife and told her she was too fat. Barbara weighed about 148 pounds at 5 feet 4 inches. By today's standards, this would be called a perfectly normal weight. But Alexis's words landed on a woman who was already fragile, who had already grown up without anyone telling her she was enough, who already had all the ingredients needed for an insult of that nature to install itself permanently. Barbara immediately began a crash diet. Nothing but black coffee for weeks at a time. She lost 44 pounds in a few months, and she established a pattern of starvation and binging that would accompany her for the rest of her life, and that the doctors who treated her decades later would formally diagnose as anorexia nervosa. The marriage to Mdivani was exactly what the butler had predicted. Alexis enjoyed Barbara's checks. He hit her when she complained. He insulted her in public with the ease of someone who knows the victim is too ashamed to react. And when Barbara had had enough, in 1935, the divorce cost her $2 million. Alexis died that same year in a car accident in Spain, driving one of the many sports cars Barbara had bought him. He was 32 years old. 2 months after the Alexis divorce, Barbara married Count Kurt von Haugwitz-Hardenberg-Reventlow, a 40-year-old Danish aristocrat. If Alexis had been a thief with good manners, Reventlow was something more dangerous, a man who wanted not just her money, but total control of her life. He convinced Barbara to surrender her American citizenship in exchange for Danish, claiming tax advantages. It was 1937. Giving up American citizenship at a moment when Europe was approaching war was a decision with potentially grave consequences. Barbara did it. The American press called her despicable. The New York Times published an editorial describing her as the shame of her country. Woolworth store employees in New York organized a protest strike. 36 stores temporarily closed. From the ship where she was sailing to Europe, someone sent her a telegram in the worker's name. "We beg you to instruct management to grant a decent wage to the thousands who exist on starvation salaries." Barbara did not respond. With Reventlow also came physical abuse in its most direct form. The historians who have documented this marriage speak of beatings that sent her to the hospital, of humiliations that drove her to a psychiatric sanatorium, and of Reventlow's explicit ambition to have her declared mentally incapable of managing her own fortune and thereby take control himself. The only positive result of that union was the birth of Lance Reventlow on February 24, 1936. Lance was Barbara's only child, and he was, according to everyone who knew them both, the only relationship in which Barbara gave and received love without the contamination of money. The divorce from Reventlow, finally obtained in 1941 after years of legal battle, restored custody of Lance to her. Barbara also recovered her American citizenship in 1943, when the war made it impossible to sustain any pretense of neutrality. And it was in that context, in California, selling war bonds and patiently rebuilding a public image her previous marriages had destroyed, that she met Cary Grant. Cary Grant, who in 1942 was perhaps the biggest male star in Hollywood, was the exact opposite of everything Barbara had encountered in a man until then. He didn't need her money. He had no title to protect or aristocratic image to finance. He was a man who had risen from poverty in Bristol, England, to the top of American cinema through his own talent and his own work, and who had no reason to approach Barbara Hutton except for herself. The press called them Cash and Cary, a wordplay on Cary Grant's name and the term for paying up front. It was the kind of wit tabloids produce, without thinking much about the people behind it. The reality, documented by everyone who knew them, was simpler and more extraordinary. Cary Grant genuinely loved Barbara Hutton. They married on July 8, 1942. There was no prenuptial agreement. Grant asked for nothing, signed nothing, negotiated nothing. When Barbara insisted on giving him money after the divorce in 1945, he refused. He was the only man in Barbara's life who took nothing of what she offered except her company. Grant also built a relationship with Lance, Barbara's son, that the boy desperately needed. A father who played with him, who took him to baseball games, who was interested in what was happening at school. Cary Grant was for Lance Reventlow, the father figure his own father had never been. Why didn't it work? Because Barbara couldn't be still. Because the life Grant offered, an ordinary, ordered life in California, without the endless parties and the Moroccan palaces and the European princes, was a life Barbara didn't know how to inhabit. Because the kind of love Grant gave her required her to stand up and do the work that any real adult relationship demands, and Barbara had grown up without anyone teaching her to do that work. Because the drugs and alcohol, which had started as social companions and become indispensable crutches, created a distance between them that neither knew how to close. They divorced in 1945. It was the most amicable divorce Barbara ever had, and it was the one that cost her most in terms of what she lost. The 4 marriages that followed can be described with brutal efficiency, more of the same, in progressively more expensive and shorter versions. Prince Igor Trubetskoy, a Russian aristocrat exiled in Paris, was the 4th husband, between 1947 and 1951. The marriage ended when he was the one who asked for the divorce, which sent Barbara into a depression so deep that she attempted suicide for the first time. Porfirio Rubirosa was the 5th husband and the most scandalously unsuitable of all. Rubirosa was Dominican, a diplomat of the dictator Rafael Trujillo's regime and the most famous playboy of post-war Europe. His reputation was so explicit that Parisian waiters who brought peppermills to the table called them Rubirosas, in reference to a physical attribute the press of the era insinuated and that later chroniclers described without euphemism. He was also the ex-husband of Doris Duke, the tobacco heiress and Barbara's lifelong rival. The press had dubbed Doris and Barbara the Golden Twins, since both of them, born a week apart in 1912, had become the 2 wealthiest young women in America. When Barbara married Rubirosa on December 30th, 1953, the press reported that Doris Duke read the news in a Swiss newspaper and took to her bed with a migraine. The marriage lasted 53 days. The press of the time recorded the moment of the divorce with a cruelty that reveals something about how the world regarded Barbara. For her 5th wedding, wrote journalist Phyllis Patel in the Milwaukee Sentinel, the bride wore black and carried a scotch and soda. The divorce cost Barbara, according to the various sources that agree on the approximate range, between $2.5 and $3.5 million, plus polo ponies, jewels, and a converted B-25 bomber. It was exactly the same type of aircraft Doris Duke had given Rubirosa in her own divorce. Neither woman found anything resembling happiness in him. Rubirosa remained Rubirosa. Baron Gottfried von Kram was the 6th husband, between 1955 and 1959. He was an elite German tennis player, one of the best in the world in the 1930s, who had lost 3 consecutive Wimbledon finals, and who during the Nazi regime had shown the courage to refuse to represent the Third Reich in international tournaments, which had cost him prison. His personal history had elements that made the marriage interesting to the press. His anti-Nazi convictions and questions about his sexual orientation that Barbara discovered during the marriage. The divorce was in 1959. Von Kram died in a traffic accident in Egypt in 1976. Pierre Raymond Daune, a French artist, was the 7th and last husband, between 1964 and their permanent separation in 1966. Her financial advisers had reached the conclusion that once again, a Barbara Hutton on the marriage market was once again a Barbara Hutton in the process of being plundered, and they arranged the final divorce without Barbara being able to prevent it. There was no 8th marriage. There was no longer enough money to finance one. In the intervals between marriages, Barbara lived in a way the press described as excess, and that was probably something more complicated. The Sidi Hosni Palace in Tangier, Morocco, which she bought in 1948, and where she spent summers for nearly 30 years, was a 16th-century building that Barbara transformed into one of the most spectacular residences in North Africa. The parties she gave there mixed European aristocrats with American diplomats, artists, writers, and Bedouin nomads who sometimes arrived with their own camels. The jeweled tapestry that hung in the main salon had cost $1 million. She gave money to poor neighbors in the quarter with the same impulsiveness with which she gave it to her rich friends. In 1945, she organized and funded a soup kitchen to feed the Riffian people arriving in Tangier, fleeing a famine in their region. It was a chaotic philanthropy, that of someone who has not learned to distinguish between those who genuinely need and those who ask because they know they can get. In Mexico, she built from scratch a Japanese-style palace in Cuernavaca on 12 hectares of land because she liked the landscape. She bought a pear-shaped 48-carat diamond, one of the largest in the world, for $400,000 in 1965, when her fortune was already clearly declining. She was incapable of stopping. Spending was the only thing she knew how to do with money she had been given, without being taught how to manage it. And while Barbara Hutton spent and married and divorced and wept and began again, Lance Reventlow grew up and became a remarkable adult. He was intelligent, gifted mechanically, with the passion for racing cars that came from somewhere in his character that could not be attributed to either parent. In the 1960s, he built his own racing team and designed the Scarab, an American racing car that competed with the best European cars at a time when Americans rarely could. He was, according to those who knew him, a warm and generous man who maintained a close and affectionate relationship with his mother, despite having grown up primarily in boarding schools and with private tutors. He was also very close to Cary Grant, who had been his father figure during the 3 years of his marriage to Barbara, and who had never entirely let go of him, even after the divorce. On July 24, 1972, Lance Reventlow died in an aviation accident. He was 36 years old. He was flying in Colorado when the plane crashed. He was the only human being in the world of whom Barbara could say with certainty that he had loved her for who she was, and not for what she had. He was the only love of her life that had been unambiguous, bidirectional, without price. And he disappeared in an accident in the skies over Colorado when she was 59 years old and still had 7 years left to live. The biographers who knew Barbara in her final years agree that Lance's death was the point after which Barbara simply decided there was no longer a reason to keep trying. Not in any dramatic or declared way, but in the quietest way. By ceasing to eat consistently, by allowing doctors to increase the doses of the medications that kept her in a permanent fog, by allowing the sycophants who had always surrounded her to give her whatever she asked for, without questioning whether what she asked for was what she needed. The actor, Cliff Robertson, Barbara's cousin by marriage, who visited her regularly with his wife, Dina Merrill, described those visits with a sadness that transcended anecdote. Each time they arrived, they found Barbara in bed, surrounded by half-empty glasses of Coca-Cola and books she no longer read. She was alert, Robertson said, but her fragility was visible. She had a lost sweetness, a sensitivity. She also had a strong and determined mind. She was surrounded by flatterers, by people in her service. Barbara was in a cocoon. She refused to get out of bed. Cary Grant tried to pull her out of that state in the final years. He was still her friend. He was still the person who, of all those who had been in her life, had most genuinely cared about her. But there was a limit to what he could do from outside that hotel suite, where Barbara had decided to wait for death. And death came on May 11th, 1979. She had sold the palaces. She had sold the jewels. She had sold the emerald tiara that had belonged to the Romanov family. She had sold the pearls that had belonged to Marie Antoinette. She had sold the 48-carat diamond. She had sold everything that could be sold. And the $3,500 that remained were divided among creditors and ex-husbands and relatives who had appeared in time to claim whatever there was. 10 people attended her funeral. She was buried in the Woolworth family mausoleum at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, New York, alongside the remains of the grandfather who had built everything she had destroyed. Her final wish? To be buried in Tangier, in the Moroccan city that was the only place in the world where she had been relatively happy for years? could not be fulfilled. There was no money left to pay for it. The story of Barbara Hutton is usually told as a story about money, how it is earned, how it is spent, how it is lost. The articles that circulate about her online carry headlines about the $900 million and the 7 weddings and the $3,000 at the end. They are headlines that work because the arithmetic of excess and ruin has something hypnotic about it, something that satisfies the human need for stories of too much fortune to end with proportionate punishment. But the story of Barbara Hutton is not really a story about money. It is the story of a 4-year-old girl who found her mother dead in a hotel room and who spent the next 62 years of her life looking for someone who would stay. Anyone who would stay, who would look at her and see something beyond the Woolworth surname and the millions that surname guaranteed, who would say no when she offered money because they didn't need the money, who would keep her company not because they were being paid but because they wanted to be there. She found that in only 2 people, in Cary Grant, who genuinely loved her but whom she couldn't hold on to because she had never learned to live with someone who needed nothing she could give, and in Lance, her son, who loved her the unconditional way good sons love difficult mothers, and who died 36 years too soon in an accident that had no reason to happen. The rest was the price she paid for that emptiness. 7 marriages, each one with someone who arrived for the money and left with the money and left her lonelier than before. A jewelry collection she sold piece by piece when there was nothing else left to sell. A body she destroyed through decades of disorder, medications and alcohol, as if she needed to prove that not even the physical shell deserved to be preserved. And a hotel suite in Beverly Hills, where she died, surrounded by paid nurses, while the world kept turning outside the closed windows. The butler who spoke to her when she was 9 years old was right. Someone always wanted to marry her for her money. What he didn't say, because perhaps he couldn't know it yet, is that the girl who found her mother dead in that room at the plaza would never have been able to distinguish between love that came for the money and love that came for herself. Because no one taught her to make that distinction. Because the person who should have taught her was dead in that room before Barbara had words to ask why. The relationship between Barbara and Frank Woolworth, the grandfather she never knew, is one of the cruelest ironies of the entire story. Woolworth died in 1919, when Barbara was 6 years old. They never spoke, but the shadow of what he had built covered her entire life. The surname on the store signs, the lines of poorly paid workers who sent letters of protest when she spent at parties what they earned in a year, the journalists who calculated in Woolworth cents the cost of each of her jewels or her weddings. She was the heiress of a man who had democratized American commerce, who had built his fortune selling at penny prices, things that previously could only be bought if you had more money. And she spent that fortune on things that could only be bought if you had more money than everyone around you. The Woolworth workers, who in 1937 organized protest strikes when Barbara renounced her American citizenship, were not entirely wrong in their anger. But they didn't have the whole story either. Barbara was not the monster of insensitivity that the press constructed over decades. She was someone who had inherited a responsibility no one had taught her to manage, and who did with it what people do when given too much too soon. Spent it, not out of malice, out of the absence of all the tools needed to do anything else. The Woolworth building in Manhattan, which her grandfather built, and which for years was the tallest building in the world, still stands. The Woolworth stores disappeared from American streets in 1997, after decades of decline in the face of competition from the big supermarkets. The Woolworth Mausoleum at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx holds the remains of the founder and his granddaughter, separated by 60 years of history and by a fortune that passed from the hands of one into the hands of the world without permanently benefiting anyone. There is a 1987 television film starring Farrah Fawcett that tells the life of Barbara Hutton. It is called Poor Little Rich Girl, the Barbara Hutton story. Fawcett played her with a precision that those who had known Barbara found surprising. The fragility, the impulsive generosity, the inability to say no to anything that promised love, even for an hour. The film earned critical and public respect. It was the best-known version of Barbara's story. But even that film, which tried to be fair, ended up turning Barbara into what the press had always made of her, a spectacle. The poor little rich girl, the object of public, fascination and pity looking at her from outside. Barbara Hutton was never only that spectacle. She was also a woman who spoke 5 languages, who loved archaeology and Persian music, who wrote poetry that her friends described as surprisingly good, who maintained for decades the Sidi Hosni Palace as a space where North African and Western European culture met on terms of equality that colonialism rarely permitted. She was a woman who, when she had money, used it to build soup kitchens and fun schools in Tangier, and give children in the neighborhood things they could never have bought for themselves. She was impulsive in everything, including in kindness. Frank Woolworth, who had spent his whole life looking upward economically, who had built from scratch the first of his stores in Utica with minimal investment, and the conviction that people with little money deserved stores where they could shop, left no instructions about how the inheritance his descendants would receive should be managed. No conditions, no time restrictions, no trust of any kind to protect the estate from the imprudence of whoever received it. The fortune was available, and when Barbara turned 21 in 1933, at the worst economic moment in modern American history, the $42 million her father had managed and multiplied since her mother's death became hers, with no mediation to protect her from herself. Estate management experts who have studied the Barbara Hutton case as an example of what not to do point out that a series of relatively simple measures would have changed the outcome. A trust with graduated disbursements would have prevented Barbara from having access to the full capital at once. A prenuptial protection clause would have limited what each husband could take in a divorce. Conditions on estate management, independent oversight, financial advice, free of conflicts of interest, any of those tools would have been enough to prevent a woman with a $900 million inheritance from ending up with $3,500 in the bank. But none of those tools was put in place, because 20th century America did not think in those terms when the heir was a young woman who would surely marry someone to handle the money. The only one of the 7 husbands who took nothing was Cary Grant. This is the detail every article about Barbara Hutton mentions, and it is the detail that illuminates most clearly the nature of all the other marriages, precisely by contrast. Grant was a man who earned his own money, who had his own career, who needed nothing from Barbara except her company. And that made the relationship with him the only one in which Barbara could be relatively certain that what she received was real and not purchased. But it also made that relationship the hardest to sustain for a woman whose only known language of love was money. If she couldn't give it, if he didn't want it, how did she show him she loved him? How did she fill the space between them when money no longer served as mediator? Grant tried to teach her. He tried to build an ordinary life with her. Breakfast without protocol, afternoons without guests, evenings without parties of 50 people. But Barbara didn't know how to inhabit that life. The stillness frightened her. The silence filled her with the same anguish as the room at the plaza where she had found her mother. She needed noise and movement and people and the constant stimulus of something new, because the new distracted from the emptiness underneath. And Cary Grant, who had his own work and his own demands, and who could not and did not want to spend his life being the noise Barbara needed to stop thinking, eventually gave up. The divorce was in 1945. Years later, Grant was still describing Barbara with affection. She was, he said in some interview, in the 1960s, someone of extraordinary sensitivity, whom the world had treated very badly from a very young age. Lance. Reventlow lived the life that Barbara might have lived if circumstances had been different. With his inheritance, he built something of his own, the racing team and the Scarab car, a genuine project of ingenuity and passion and work. He had friends who loved him for who he was. He had an affectionate relationship with his mother, visiting her regularly and calling her frequently. When he died in the aviation accident in 1972, he was 36 years old and had a life worth living. Cary Grant, who had been his father figure and who had never stopped caring about him after the divorce from Barbara, helped organize the funeral and attended. It was the kind of loyalty Grant extended to the people who had been part of his life, regardless of the terms in which the formal relationship had ended. The news of Lance's death reached Barbara in her hotel. Those who saw her in the hours and days that followed said something in her went out permanently. It was not a dramatic collapse, it was something quieter and more final. The tacit decision, never declared but perfectly visible to those who watched, that there was no longer a reason to make the effort to be present. She lived 7 more years, but the life she lived in those 7 years was not quite life. The story of Barbara Hutton has dimensions that go beyond the individual. It is also the story of an era and a social class that the 20th century was simultaneously building and destroying. The European aristocracy that Barbara financed through her marriages was the residue of a social order that the 2 world wars had liquidated politically, but that survived socially through the inertia of titles and customs. The Medivani princes, Count Reventlow, Baron von Kram, Prince Trubetskoy, all were representatives of a world that no longer existed and that needed American money to keep pretending it did. Barbara was the ATM of that world. She fed it for years with checks and palaces and the veneer of legitimacy that came from being the official wife of someone with a European title. And that world devoured her. Count Kurt von Haugwitz-Hardenberg-Reventlow deserves a specific paragraph, because his story with Barbara was the most dangerous and most damaging of all. He did not just take her money. He did not just beat her to the point of hospitalizing her on multiple occasions. He also attempted something more systematic, stripping her of her legal identity. The American citizenship Barbara surrendered in 1937 at Reventlow's request was not a minor detail. It was the jurisdiction under which she lived, the legal system that protected her, the flag that identified her in the world. Losing it on the eve of the Second World War meant entering a legal limbo that Reventlow, who knew exactly what he was doing, could have exploited to have her declared incompetent and seize control of her fortune through Danish courts. Barbara managed to survive that attempt, but the cost was high. Years of dependence on sedatives and tranquilizers that had begun as the only way to endure nights with Reventlow and became a permanent addition to her existence. The seedy Hosni Palace in Tangier that Barbara maintained for nearly 30 years was finally sold in 1975, 4 years before her death, when her resources were no longer sufficient to sustain it. It was a 16th century building in the heart of the Medina that Barbara had transformed into one of the most spectacular private residences in North Africa. Rooms lined with polychrome tiles, gardens with marble fountains, terraces with views of the Strait of Gibraltar, a library with thousands of volumes in 5 languages, and that jeweled tapestry in the main salon that had cost $1 million and depicted the story of 1001 nights, embroidered in gold and silver threads and precious stones. All of it sold. The seedy Hosni Palace passed through several hands after Barbara, and today exists with the discretion that kind of building acquires when its owners prefer anonymity. Her jewelry collection, which the experts who knew it described as one of the most important ever accumulated by a private individual in the 20th century, dispersed piece by piece in the final decades of her life. The emerald tiara that had belonged to the Romanov family, which Barbara had purchased through Cartier, and which represented one of the most historically significant pieces in her collection, ended up with Van Cleef and Arpels, who dissolved the emeralds and sold them separately. Their current owners are unknown. The jade necklace her father had given her for her first wedding, with a clasp of rubies, diamonds and platinum added by Cartier, sold at auction in Hong Kong in 2014 for $27.5 million. It was one of the most valuable jade jewels ever to pass through a public auction. One of the most revealing stories about Barbara's final years comes from actor Cliff Robertson, whose wife Dina. Merrill was Barbara's cousin. Robertson and his wife visited her regularly at the Beverly Wilshire, the Los Angeles hotel, where Barbara spent her last years rarely getting out of bed. Each time they arrived, they found the same scene: Barbara in bed, surrounded by glasses of Coca-Cola, the television on, and books piled up that she no longer read. Nurses came and went. Doctors adjusted the doses. No one asked her how she really was, because no one wanted to hear the answer. Robertson said that Barbara had a lost sweetness impossible not to notice, a sensitivity the world had beaten her but not managed to eliminate. It was one of the most honest observations anyone had made about her in years. The sum remaining in her account at death, those $3,500 that every chronicle repeats as the final number of her story, was actually disputed. Some people who knew her said in later interviews that the figure was not accurate, that there were other assets not in the main bank account. But the narrative had been fixed, and the number had circulated too widely for any qualification to change it. It was the kind of detail that stories need to function. The exact number at the end of the road, the arithmetic evidence of the collapse. What that number does not capture is what Barbara did preserve until the end. She preserved her intelligence, which those who visited her in the final years described as alert, even when the body was barely functioning. She preserved her affection for those who took the trouble to come see her, and her impulsive generosity with them. If someone mentioned they liked something in the room, Barbara gave it away immediately with the same impulsiveness with which she had given away diamonds and palaces in her days of splendor. She preserved the memory of Lance with a fidelity that her visitors found painful. She spoke of him with the ease of someone who had not fully accepted that he was gone. The final image of Barbara Hutton that deserves to be preserved is not the one in the headlines, not the scandals, not the divorces, not the $3,500 at the end. It is the image of a 4-year-old girl whom no one protected when she needed protecting, whom no one taught what she needed to learn, and who spent 62 more years trying to build with money what should have been built with presence and time and unconditional love when she was still small and the foundations are formed. The fortune she spent was enormous by any measure applied. The stories surrounding her are fascinating in the way stories of excess and fall are fascinating. But underneath all that is something more ordinary and more universal. A person who did not receive what she needed when she needed it, and who spent her entire life looking for it in the places where it could not be found. It is not a story about money. It is a story about childhood, and about what is lost when no one is there. When she died, only Cary Grant, of all, those who had been close to her, called to ask the right question: who is making sure she gets a decent burial? The man who took nothing of what she had was the only one who cared about what she needed at the end. There is something in that worth more than all the anecdotes about diamonds and palaces and European princes. Something that says everything that needs to be said about who Barbara Hutton really was and what her life, in truth, meant. Frank Woolworth built the tallest building in the world in 1913 with the pennies of the American working class. 57 floors of granite and terracotta, with neo-Gothic gargoyles and marble mosaics in the lobby, financed entirely in cash without a mortgage, because Woolworth did not believe in debt. It was called the Cathedral of Commerce. President Woodrow Wilson inaugurated it personally by pressing a button at the White House that simultaneously lit 80,000 bulbs. It was April 24th, 1913, 4 years before Edna's death, 6 before Woolworth's own death, 9 before the birth of the girl who would receive all that fortune and who would not know what to do with it, because no one had taught her what to do with anything. There is a parallel that Barbara's biographers rarely note, but that is significant. Frank Woolworth also had a difficult childhood. He was also poor. He also knew rejection and failure before success. But Woolworth converted that experience into a constructive energy that led him to build something permanent. Barbara converted her childhood pain into a destructive energy that led her to destroy everything she had been given. This is not a moral judgment. It is simply the observation that money inherits without the character that produced it, and that character cannot be inherited with a check. The question Barbara Hutton's story poses, without quite answering, is whether anyone could have done something different with what fell to her. Her father could have been present. Her mother could have sought help. Her grandparents could have established a trust with conditions that protected her from her own impulsiveness. The men she married could have been decent people. The system that surrounded her, which knew perfectly well that a young woman with $50 million and no legal protection was easy prey, could have functioned differently. Any of those variables changed would have produced a different story. None of them changed, and Barbara Hutton was the result of all of them together, exactly as it is with all people. We are not only what we choose, but also what happens to us before we can choose. The label the press gave her, the poor little rich girl, was cruel in the way the nicknames the public puts on the famous tend to be cruel. It had enough truth to work, and enough simplification to be unjust. She was poor in what matters, and rich in what doesn't. She was a girl who could never quite grow up, because no one was there to help her grow. She was, in the deepest sense of the expression, a person who never had enough of the only thing that is truly necessary, and who used everything she did have in the attempt to find it. If this story has moved you, if at any moment you found yourself thinking about what it means to have everything the world considers important, and not have the one thing that truly matters, leave your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to know more about the great heiresses of the 20th century, about the women who lived at the intersection of extreme money and extreme loneliness, this channel has more stories like this one, the ones that go beyond the scandal and reach the human. Subscribe!